At about the same time that the second wave of the Industrial Revolution was happening, there was also the introduction of a new age, the rise of imperialism. Now, just like the Industrial Revolution, imperialism also required a set of conditions, and that's really the story that we're going to look at today. We've talked already about how Napoleon's actions had pretty drastic ramifications for Spanish and Portuguese holdings in the Americas. What we haven't covered is how Napoleon's movements across Europe were dealt with in Europe after his final defeat. Now, when Napoleon had finally been defeated in 1815, the Allies met at Vienna, and they discussed how they might reorganize Europe, and this included changing borders, so as to return as much as possible to the status quo. The Congress of Vienna was this meeting of the great powers to determine this aftermath. Napoleon's empire building had seriously changed Europe's borders between 1800 and 1814. For example, the Holy Roman Empire completely disappeared. Lots of monarchies had been taken over and were headed by Napoleon's brothers. This had happened especially in Western Europe. France itself had expanded at the expense of Italians, the Austrians, as well as other German states. So the first order of business was to restore traditional, mostly absolutist monarchies within Europe, with the original ruling families. This is known as the conservative restoration, and in fact we can look at the Congress of Vienna as a conservative backlash, not just to Napoleon, but even to some of the ideals of the Enlightenment, because they felt that the Enlightenment had allowed Napoleon to come to power. So for instance, in France, you have the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty. This is under Louis XVIII, who was the younger brother of Louis XVI. He takes the number 18 in honor of his nephew, who died in prison during the Reign of Terror. In Spain, you have the return of Ferdinand VII. It's still the Habsburgs in charge of Spain. And in the Netherlands, you have the restoration of William, who was a member of the House of Orange, the house that had ruled the Netherlands for a very long time. Now, the second order of business was war reparations, trading lands and money so that the victors felt vindicated in their defeat of Napoleon. And if we look at the map closely, we can see just how extensive the French Empire was. And I'm not even talking about all of Europe, just the territories that France controlled directly. The current French borders are somewhere here and here-ish. Look at all of this additional territory that the French monarchs controlled as a result of Napoleon's expansionism. So all of that had to be determined, in addition to figuring out what should happen in Central and Eastern Europe. How should those borders be drawn? Well, despite the fact that this was a conservative restoration, the Holy Roman Empire was not reformed. The Confederation of German States essentially remained in place, but what happened was that Austria and Prussia each had a sphere of influence within the German states. Prussia would influence the northern German states, while the Austrian Empire would continue to influence the southern German states. In addition, Prussia is going to earn lands in the west as well as in the east as a result of these negotiations. Austria-Hungary is going to retain northern Italian territories that had been taken over by Napoleon. Now, the Netherlands were interesting. Taken over directly by Napoleon during his era of rule, the Netherlands get ceded Austria-Netherlands. This is basically modern-day Belgium. And as a result of that, the Netherlands get to expand their territory and become a proper kingdom. However, you can't get something for nothing, and the price for their expansion in Europe was that they had to give up some part of their vast trading empire. The price, it turns out, was Cape Colony at the tip of South Africa, and this territory was ceded to Great Britain. So, as it turns out, the big winner in this land exchange extravaganza was Great Britain, who gained no additional lands in Europe, not that they wanted them, but they did extend their colonial empire quite significantly. They added port islands in the Caribbean and Asia, because France had to give them up, and they added Cape Colony in the south of Africa. The third order of business for the Congress of Vienna was ensuring that another Napoleonic period did not occur in Europe. So they wanted to create an alliance system that would ensure a diplomatic discussion of problems instead of using war as diplomacy. And keep in mind that they'd been using war as diplomacy since the time of Louis XIV, so this was a pretty radical shift in ideology. Some of the countries wanted a Christian-based alliance. They felt that this was the only way to counter some of the more secular ideals of the Enlightenment. These countries formed what was called the Holy Alliance. These included Austria-Hungary, Prussia, and Russia. Eventually, though, another organization, one that would supersede the Holy Alliance, was formed, and this was called the Concert of Europe. So once the Concert of Europe is formed, Great Britain and France join the Holy Alliance. And these countries refer to themselves as the great powers of Europe. And the whole idea behind the Concert of Europe is that there would be a balance of power within Europe. And in this way, they pretty much guaranteed negotiation as opposed to war. Now, did it help? Kinda. The 19th century is often referred to as the peaceful century or the long 19th century because, in comparison to the almost constant warfare of previous centuries, it was peaceful. But that doesn't mean that there weren't insurrections, it doesn't mean that there weren't battles, and of course, even wars. For instance, we already talked about the revolutions of 1848 and how these sprang up as if out of thin air, and it really surprised quite a few of the conservative governments in Europe. Of course, by 1848, we know that the reality of the Industrial Revolution had caused serious upheaval among urban social classes. As working environments for them got worse, workers were more liable to revolt. And in fact, if we look at patterns in the Revolution of 1848, what we see is that in places where the Industrial Revolution really had taken hold, which is primarily in Northern and Western Europe, then these were social tensions caused by the Industrial Revolution. That's what they were rebelling about. However, in places where the Industrial Revolution hadn't really taken hold, people were revolting over ethnic tensions or nationalism. And this is what happens primarily in Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe. Now, you already know that France had two revolutions in 1848. And what you probably don't know is that they had what might count as a third in 1848 as well. Now, with the first revolution, the one in February, you have the abdication of Louis Philippe, and the bourgeoisie, who kind of come into power after that, establish the Second French Republic. They finally, by October, after the June days, settle on a constitution, and this constitution calls for elections for a president so that the republic has an executive figure. There were all sorts of candidates for the job, and interestingly enough, one of the candidates had a really familiar name. His name was Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. He was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, and he hadn't been raised in France at all. When he was a child, he'd been raised in Belgium because his father was the king of the Netherlands, and then he'd been raised partly in Italy. So he didn't have a whole lot of experience in France, and yet he decided to go ahead and run for office. And of course, he won. Within 4 years, though, the Republic was history, as the President of the Republic declared himself the Emperor of the Second French Empire and took the name Napoleon III, this time in honor of his cousin, Napoleon Bonaparte's son. Now, when the Second French Empire was founded in 1852, France had a widespread empire, but it wasn't really connected in any way. And you can see this on the map. They control some territories in Africa. They've got a little bit of a foothold in Southeast Asia and a tiny little snippet of South America. But that's not going to dissuade Louis Napoleon. He is going to, as emperor, really make sure that everyone else knows that France is absolutely a great power in Europe. Once he became emperor, Napoleon III kept pushing himself into other countries' business. Like his uncle, he viewed Russia as a particular threat to France and to French expansion, and he kept a close eye on any movements the Russian army made. Now, to be fair, Russia was trying to expand its territory at the expense of the northern and eastern edge of the Ottoman Empire. If we look at the map, we can see this pretty clearly. What Russia wanted was to gain more territory right here, along the coastline of the Black Sea. Let's stop and think about why that might be. Hopefully, you thought about access to the Mediterranean. If they had control of the Black Sea area, then Russia would be able to use the Aegean Sea to get to the Mediterranean and be able to expand their naval prospects. This was a really powerful incentive. Since the other great powers of Europe saw the Ottoman Empire as a necessary buffer between the expansionist tendencies of the Russians and the Austrians, Napoleon III was able to convince the British government to help France intervene on the part of the Ottoman Empire. So when Russia marches against the Ottoman Empire, France and Britain declare war on Russia. This is what causes the outbreak of the Crimean War. We're going to make a long story pretty short. Russia lost the war after a couple of spectacular losses. Clearly, Russia's still not over that because primarily what they were fighting over was the Crimean Peninsula. But Russia's loss isn't the important legacy of the Crimean War, or at least not the important short-term legacy. The important legacies were that the Crimean War was really the first modern war in that it included many of the innovations of the Industrial Revolution. For instance, steamboats transported French and British troops and supplies to the Black Sea area. Western armies used the Enfield rifle. These are rifles that loaded bullets at the back end, not on the front, and these were safer and more efficient than front-loading rifles. And the telegraph allowed armies and journalists to report back to the home front very quickly. Additionally, the Crimean War was the first one documented in photographs. And these are not going to be grisly photographs like the photographs we see of the American Civil War just a few years later. These tended to be before and after photographs, so the landscape before the battle, the landscape after the battle. Nonetheless, when these photographs were printed in European newspapers, for the very first time, people sitting at home had a real sense of what the war was like, and they knew my husband, brother, son is fighting out there. That's what's going on. Now, finally, and maybe most importantly, long term, is that we get an increase in medical conditions for troops in the field. And this is all thanks to an Englishwoman by the name of Florence Nightingale. She reads about the horrific problems of the troops in the Crimean War, and she realizes that they're dying not because they have awful wounds, but because there's a significant time gap between when they're wounded and when they can get to medical attention. So she travels to the Crimean area, and she helps set up the first field hospitals on the fields of battle. And in the process, she also introduces women to an entirely new occupation, for them anyway, and this is nursing. So why were the great powers so eager to fight against one another, even having promised this sort of balance of power? Well, we can kind of sum up that whole impetus with one word: nationalism. Nationalism is pride in one's ethnicity or culture or country. In fact, very often it's also referenced as patriotism. But nationalism is a little more extreme than patriotism, and it emerges as a really important aspect of 19th century Western culture. Now, nationalism can take a variety of forms, and throughout all of human history, various types of movements have formed in response to nationalist ideals. For example, we can have three types right here on the chart: state building, separation, and unification. Well, the state building kind of nationalism starts when distinct groups agree to form a new state, and they do that by accepting a single culture or idea. And this happens in the United States when the 13 colonies, almost all of which have quite different governments and different economic ideals, go ahead and come together under this idea, this concept of a specific kind of republican government. Separation nationalism occurs when a culturally distinct group wants to break away from a larger group, or they seek to resist annexation by a larger group. We see this in the Austrian rebellions of 1848, when all of those ethnic groups, the Magyars and the Croats and the Serbs, wanted to break away from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And finally, we have the unification kind of nationalism. These are mergers of politically divided but culturally similar lands. We see this especially during this time period in the unifications of both Italy and Germany. For both of these countries, their unification process is going to start in the 1850s and really run until about 1871. Let's talk about Italy first. Beginning in the middle of the 19th century, Italian nationalists moved to achieve unification. It had been tried before in the 1820s, but it had failed. In Italy, the new organizer of the unification movement was Count Camillo Benso di Cavour. He was a noble, and he allied with a commoner, Giuseppe Garibaldi, who helped to organize the Italian people into mobile armies. So Cavour worked on the nobility and trying to convince them why this was a good idea. Garibaldi did the fighting against those people who didn't want to see Italian unification. And Garibaldi had learned his military arts through his work in various Latin American independence movements. So he comes with some experience about unifying and forming a new government. And by 1870, an Italian army had captured the last holdout against unification, which ended up being the city-state of Rome. A year later, Italy's unification was official. Italy became a constitutional monarchy under the leadership of a North Italian noble who took the title Vittorio Emanuele I. Now, just as Italian unification required war, so too did German unification. Germany's unification owes much to a chancellor by the name of Otto von Bismarck, who is selected by a not very popular king to kind of run interference for him. And it's Bismarck who really understands the need for German unification. He's an aristocrat, he's a traditionalist, he very much wants to see Germany become a monarchy, but first, of course, he has to create a Germany. Now, for Bismarck, nothing united a people like facing a common enemy, and the one way that people faced a common enemy was through war. Accordingly, Bismarck used wars to great advantage in bringing about German unification. So, a quick point of order here. The state, the German state, which begins the unification process is called Prussia. Prussia was basically this territory in northern Central Europe. Prussia had converted to Protestantism during the Protestant Reformation and was primarily Lutheran. And they were influential in the northern German states. Now, they stood as a contrast then to the Austrian Empire, which influenced the southern German states and, of course, was strongly Catholic. So between 1866 and 1870, Prussia and other German states would slowly come together by fighting a series of wars against outsiders. The first one basically unifies the northern German states, and he pretty much manufactures a war against Denmark. And then the final war is between Prussia and France, with the added bonus of having to force Napoleon III's abdication. And this is going to unite the remainder of the German states, so that by the time he's defeated France, Bismarck has put together a pretty large German state, right smack dab in the middle of Europe. Napoleon III, as I mentioned, was forced to abdicate the throne when the Prussian army surrounded Paris. He flees France, and of course that brings about the end of the Second French Empire. In the aftermath, Prussia will not take over France. Prussia, of course, becomes Germany. France becomes a republic, and that'll be the Third French Republic. So even as Italy and Germany are fighting to bring themselves to the modern age and create their unified countries, you have some of the other countries in Europe doing something quite different. This is especially true of Great Britain, who of course is leaps and bounds ahead of everyone else in industrialization, and as it turns out, is also leaps and bounds ahead of everyone in terms of imperialism. But of course you might ask, what in the world is imperialism? Well, let's study that by looking at the differences between colonialism, which is an era we've already covered, and imperialism. So you can see, colonialism is a system, and in this system, a state claims sovereignty, state power, over territories and resources that didn't originally belong to it. And as a result of this, they displace or rule the native population. And as a result of that, you have increasingly large empires, which are meant to be settler empires. So Great Britain sent settlers to North America. Spain sent settlers to Mexico. The general time period of the colonial age is from the 15th century, and that would be the very late 15th century, of course, to the 18th century. And the geographic focus, especially for Europeans, because they're the ones who bring about the age of colonialism, it's going to be Southeast Asia and South Asia, that's the beginning of it, and then the Americas, and towards the tail end of the 18th century, Oceania. Imperialism, on the other hand, is more of a policy, and this is a policy of extending control over foreign entities. These can be states, these can be tribes, these can be fiefdoms, it can be pretty much anything. And they do this either directly or indirectly using political or economic intervention. This is the type of control that tended to happen here in the middle of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century. And the geographic focus, now that of course the Americas are independent, tended to be Africa and Asia. So what we see is, beginning in the 1816, 1870s, European powers began a new concerted effort to expand their territory, primarily through this acquisition of imperial colonies. Why? Well, there's lots of reasons. For example, industrialization. As you've seen, industrialization occurred in two waves. The age of imperialism really does coincide with the second wave. Britain had various conditions which allowed for the adoption of industrialization and its spread. We've covered that already. The introduction of industrialization across continental Europe and the Americas then begins to occur later in the century. Now, that's great. You have more goods, they're made more cheaply, you can hire lots and lots of people, maybe their working conditions aren't the best, But what ends up happening is that these countries, or I should say entrepreneurs within these countries, quickly realized that they needed colonial empires so that they could exploit the industrial economy. They needed large amounts of raw resources so that they could manufacture those into finished goods. And they also needed markets. They needed people to sell their new products to. So countries that already had colonial empires, like Britain or France, could just jump right into the Industrial Revolution. They could take natural resources from their old colonies, fix them up, sell them back to their colonial peoples. The countries who didn't already or still have colonial empires, now Spain, Italy, Germany, Russia, these are the ones that are going to struggle a little bit to compete industrially with those who did. But after 1871, when both Italy and Germany achieved unification, those countries become focused on the accumulation of colonies, and so a new age of expansion begins. Additionally, the rivalry between the great powers doesn't just end with the Crimean War, and in fact, it really diverges into ultranationalism, which is the extreme pride in one's country and loyalty to that country's agenda, to the point that you disregard the effects that such loyalty might have on other countries or other peoples. Now, such extreme devotion and belief led to the emergence of really serious rivalries between the great powers. Well, how do you prove that you're better than your rival? Well, easy. You get more colonies. You have a bigger empire. What you see here on the slide are various incarnations of these ultranationalist movements. You see here a little statue that could be purchased and then displayed at your home. All she's missing is the British flag. You have here the image of Germania, right? Now a unified state with the use of the Prussian eagle there in the middle. And then you have even the kind of hand-in-hand workings of the Scandinavian countries and how they pledged to come together and form a unified goal against everyone else. Perhaps as a somewhat inevitable effect of ultranationalism, you also have the rise of a new idea, which is social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is pretty well illustrated in this political cartoon. So let's stop a little and look at the image. Notice the title. It's a pretty jarring image for an audience in the 21st century. It should be for us, not so much for the audience at its time, which is right at the turn of the 20th century. So European ultranationalism emerges and causes rivalries between European countries, but at the same time, Europeans collectively believed that they were the best race on Earth. But how did they prove it? They took an idea from Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species, which was published in 1859, in which Darwin introduces the concept of natural selection. While the text caused, and continues to cause, all sorts of tension, another English biologist and philosopher, Herbert Spencer, conflated Darwin's original idea, which was on biology and evolution, and he made it encompass all human activity, including the creation of societies. It was Spencer who coins the phrase survival of the fittest, which he said was like Darwin's natural selection, and which he defined as the fact that the most fit organism, or society, would win against all others. And by this logic, since Europeans were the fittest race on Earth, it was only fitting that they should expand to encompass the entirety of the Earth with their empires, and to educate non-Europeans in the European way. This is what comes to be known as social Darwinism. This idea took pretty strong hold in Europe, and it will also in the United States. Obviously, this is an American political cartoon. It was an understanding, eventually, that social Darwinism was also something of a moral responsibility, and it was that sense of moral responsibility that comes to be known as the white man's burden. Rudyard Kipling, a well-known author of the 19th century, even wrote a poem about it. Now you'll read it in its entirety your senior year, but here's a quick excerpt. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. So really think about what that showed. Europeans, white people in the world, really believed that they were superior to other peoples, other societies, other quote-unquote races, and that it was their responsibility to educate these people however they saw fit, even if that means forcibly taking them and educating them in a European mentality. So what were the first inklings of imperialism? Well, perhaps inevitably, the story starts with Great Britain. Britain's first contacts with India happened in the late 17th, early 18th centuries between the British East India Tea Company, the EIC, and the Indian Mughal government. We've already looked at this history before, several times, in fact. Remember that the EIC, so as to maximize their trading profit, took control of larger and larger parts of India. Sometimes they did this through conquest, as a company taking over territories. Sometimes they did this through negotiation, which you can kind of see happening in that image up there. As the EIC took control of these larger portions of India, they hired Indians to be soldiers for the EIC. Remember, they were called sepoys. Over the course of the 18th and early 19th century, Mughal power diminished while that of the EIC increased. The EIC had wealth, they had jobs, and they could offer security to Indian workers. And so we get an image of India as a prosperous, working colony, just like the image down below shows. Similarly, the Dutch East India Company, which we call the VOC, had taken over Indonesia, which were known as the Spice Islands, and they used them precisely the same way that Britain or the East India Company used India and Pakistan as a colony that benefited the home country. This was the traditional age of colonialism. Now, it's inevitable that these European powers are going to come into conflict with the great Asian powers that were already around when the age of colonialism began. The problem is that these clashes didn't tend to occur until the age of imperialism was about to start, and so the ways in which these powers interacted was a little bit different from the earlier colonial period. Again, let's look at Britain. In the late 18th century, the British had realized that opium was a really valuable cash crop. Made from the poppy flower, opium was harvested and sold worldwide, going on British ships, and it contributed to a problem of addiction which plagues Britain and the west coast of the United States in the later part of the 19th century and in the earliest 20th century. But initially, the British had been introduced to opium as a medicinal concoction, and they grew opium in northern India, where the climate favors opium production, but really quickly realized that just across the border, China also had prime opium growing land. Now, the British had sown and then sold opium in India, and they began to realize that the Chinese also liked to use opium. The difference was that in China, opium was a controlled substance. The Chinese used it medicinally. They grew enough opium in China just for that purpose, and they did not want to see the British start to sell Indian opium in China. Nonetheless, the British kept smuggling opium over the border between British India and China. And you can see that on the map, the different routes that they took to bring opium to China. Now, the Chinese government grew quite angry at this, and in the meantime, some of the British also convinced Chinese farmers to grow opium on the sly, selling them on the black market to Chinese buyers, contributing to a growing problem of addiction in China. The Chinese government goes to war over this situation where they really feel like they're losing control over their countrymen. The Opium Wars, which are fought between 1839 and 1860, are really Anglo-Chinese wars, and they're a war about who's going to have political and economic influence, but especially economic influence, in China. This is going to be the first strike against the Qing Empire, where Europeans, and in this case primarily the British, are really able to force their own agenda on the Chinese. The Chinese are never going to be able to stamp out the sale of opium in China, and as a result, opium addiction becomes a pretty significant problem within China. Of course, you've already learned about the other great clash between the British and the Indians, when in the middle of the 19th century, the Indian sepoys finally rise up against the British because they fear that they have been sold a lie, that they've been told that the new cartridges for the Enfield rifle are greased in the wrong kind of animal fat, either cow or pig fat. And this is a problem for Hindu or Muslim soldiers who refuse to use these cartridges in these new Enfield rifles. When they rebel, the British government oppresses the rebellion pretty severely. And in the aftermath of the Sepoy Rebellion in 1858, you have the EIC slowly reverting power of India over to the British government. As a consequence, of course, in 1876, Queen Victoria is named the Empress of India. To protect their lucrative colony of India better, the British are going to create colonies in Southeast Asia. They're going to create the colony of Singapore on the Malay Islands in 1819, and later they're going to take control of Burma, modern-day Myanmar, to have Indian protection for that area of the world, because of course India was an incredibly lucrative colony. Well, France also had territories in Southeast Asia to protect. The French had sent Catholic missionaries to Vietnam in the early 1800s. These missionaries built churches and schools, and they began educating the populace. Well, by the 1840s, local Vietnamese authorities felt that they were losing control of Vietnam's culture, and so they began to persecute the missionaries. At the same time, though, you had some Vietnamese scholars who had been educated on the European system who felt that Vietnam should adopt at least some of the elements of European culture. So you had a push-pull even within Vietnam itself. In response to the heightened violence against French citizens, France moved to make Vietnam a protectorate of the French Empire in 1859, and after fighting a war against the Vietnamese, they occupied Saigon and established Vietnam as a colony of the French Empire. Vietnam's value to France came in the form of an important cash crop, and this would be rice. And you can see in the image here that you basically have two armies who are fighting very different ways. You have the fall of Saigon, where the French are able to fight with their industrial weapons, and you have the Vietnamese soldiers who are essentially still fighting with swords. By the turn of the 20th century, the French are going to take over an increasingly large part of Southeast Asia, and they're going to combine these colonies into what they called the Union of French Indochina. This included the modern-day countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The rise of imperialism is also going to affect other parts of Asia that had, up until this point in time, not really been affected by Europeans moving about the world, because there were some areas in Asia that had become buffer zones between the European powers. This was a way to maintain the balance of power that seemed so important at the Congress of Vienna. While Britain maintained control of the Indian subcontinent, including what is now Pakistan and Bangladesh, Russia wanted part of that area, and they feared that Britain would use India to expand northward into the Russian Empire. So at the heart, really, of this disagreement was this area that you see in yellow, which is basically modern-day Afghanistan, as well as Persia. What do you do with these areas? Now, both Russia and Britain were involved in Afghan politics, and eventually they're going to agree to maintain Afghanistan as a buffer zone between British areas and Russian areas of Central Asia. But this little game that they played to one-up one another in Afghanistan, this is what was known as the Great Game. The same tension existed between these two powers with regards to Persia. Once home to the large Safavid Empire, Persia was now basically a weak kingdom surrounded either by colonies or dying empires, like the Ottoman Empire to its west. The possibilities that Persia could be beneficial as a colony was attractive to both Russia and Britain, but at the same time, they didn't want to prompt a war over the territory. So Persia, like Afghanistan, is going to remain a buffer zone between the two countries. This also happens actually in Southeast Asia, where both Britain and France agree to maintain Siam, basically Thailand, as a buffer zone between British and French colonies. So basically this area right there. As you might expect, the already existing Asian governments like the Qing Empire are going to have to scramble to try to meet Europeans on a level playing field. And the bottom line is that they just can't. The Qing Empire, like the Mughal Empire before it, is going to suffer increasingly from fragmentation, and much of that is at the hands of the Europeans or European ideas. For example, China experiences a civil war called the Taiping Rebellion in the middle of the 19th century. This was a war that was similar in intent to the French Revolution, in that the lower classes wanted greater power within the empire. But additionally, it was caused by ethnic tensions and the encroachment of foreigners, such as the British, in Chinese affairs. Additionally, the Taipings used Protestant Christianity as one of their philosophies, so European ideas were coming into China and really taking hold there. The message of the Taipings was messianic. The Taiping founder believed himself to be, or at least he said he was, the younger brother of Jesus. And so the Taipings rallied around him and fought for his place as the head of the Chinese government. Now, there were serious consequences to Chinese stability after the Taiping Rebellion was stopped. First of all, since Europeans helped the Chinese government, the Qing dynasty, stop the Taiping Rebellion, all of a sudden you've got kind of these favors to repay, right? There was economic instability in China thanks to the government's overextension. Now, they already were in debt from fighting off the Opium Wars. They were already fighting to counteract opium addiction in China. Now they have to deal with the aftermath of the Taiping Rebellion and widespread economic depression because the Taiping Rebellion lasts for several years. And as a result of that, you don't really have a whole lot of farming going on. And so people don't have enough food. And of course, they blame the government for that. In addition, there was decentralization in the aftermath of the rebellion. While the central Qing government was aided by both the British and the French in ending the rebellion, other Chinese regions had depended instead on other foreign countries for political and economic help. And you can kind of see it happening here, where China loses, just flat out loses certain territories, but then in reality, they've got different spheres of influence in different parts of China. Now, as a result, the Qing Empire essentially fractures into various warlordships and other foreign powers, not just Britain and France, but also the United States, Germany, and Russia, all get more heavily involved in Chinese politics from the 1860s onwards. So the rise of imperialism required the rise of industrialization, because otherwise Europeans would not have been looking for foreign markets at which to sell their goods. But at the same time, this new focus on colonies and territories is going to put immense pressure on already existing governments. And they're not going to be able really to stand up against the Europeans who believe themselves to be superior, and at least in the short term, their arms, military arms, are more superior. And so one by one, we're going to see foreign countries fall apart. And eventually you're going to be able to look at a map of the world and think, oh my goodness, Europe really does control most of this. But that's a story for another day.